Welcome. I'm glad you're here. I've been waiting a while to finally say these words. If you're listening at this hour, you probably know exactly what it feels like to lie awake, staring into the dark, wondering if the silence is truly empty. You know that feeling of being watched, or the sensation of footsteps that shouldn't exist. I'm not here to scare you with ghosts or monsters. I'm just here to share a few things that happened to me, things that I still can't make sense of, no matter how much I try. Let's get into the first one. This happened to me during my second week on the night shift at the City General ER. It was around 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the fluorescent lights seem to hum in a pitch that vibrates your teeth. I was the only nurse on the floor, stuck in the small triage office with the heavy steel door and the glass partition looking out into the chaotic waiting room. For months, the night had been predictable. The smell of antiseptic, the crackle of the radio, the occasional sobbing family member. But 3 nights ago, something shifted. I noticed the security cameras weren't syncing properly. The timestamp on the monitor in the corner would lag, showing a time 5 minutes behind the actual clock on the wall. At first, I thought it was a glitch with the old system, something the janitor, Dave, had been complaining about for weeks. I tried to ignore it, focused on charting a patient's vitals, but then I noticed the reflection in the glass partition. A man in a gray coat was standing on the other side, just staring at me through the glass. When I turned my head, the corridor behind me was empty, and when I looked back at the glass, he was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or a tired hallucination from the long hours. I adjusted my glasses, took a sip of cold coffee, and told myself to stay alert. The problem wasn't just the man, it was that the silence started to feel heavy, like the air had been pulled out of the room. The radio stopped playing static and began broadcasting a low, rhythmic thrumming that I couldn't hear through the speakers, but could feel in my chest. The man in the gray coat reappeared, closer now, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated so much the irises were almost gone, and he was mouthing something I couldn't hear. I stood up, heart hammering against my ribs, and walked over to the door to check the hallway. It was empty. I turned back to the glass, and he was inside the room with me, standing right behind my chair. When I spun around, there was no one there. Then the man reappeared on the other side of the glass, tapping on it with a long, pale finger. I called the supervisor, but the phone line was dead, just a flat line. I tried the intercom, but all I got was that same thrumming noise, louder now, vibrating through the floor tiles. I locked the door, my breath coming in short gasps, and waited for the noise to stop. It never did. The thrumming became a scream, a sound that wasn't auditory but felt like the air itself was tearing apart. The man in the gray coat was no longer tapping, he was pulling himself up onto the glass, his fingers elongating, stretching like taffy as he tried to push his face through the pane. The glass didn't break, it rippled, softening like warm wax. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the noise. He pushed through, not breaking the surface, but walking through it as if it were water. He reached out, his hand passing through the desk, and grabbed my wrist. His skin was ice cold, colder than any winter I've ever known, and it burned when it touched me. I tried to pull away, but he didn't pull me, he just held on, his grip unyielding. Then he leaned in, his face inches from mine, and I saw that his mouth was open, but there was no tongue, no teeth, just a dark, hollow cavity. He whispered something that sounded like my name, but in a voice that belonged to 1,000 different people speaking at once. Then he pulled me backward, dragging me through the glass into the waiting room. I woke up on the floor of the triage office an hour later, or so I thought. The sun was coming up, casting long shadows across the linoleum. The radio was playing normal music, and the timestamp was syncing perfectly with the wall clock. My supervisor, Dave, came in to check on me, asking why I was on the floor. I told him I must have dozed off. He laughed, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I got up, brushed the dust off my scrubs, and went back to work. The only thing that didn't make sense was the glass partition. It was intact, perfectly clean, with no scratches, no smudges, and no sign of any effort being made to break it. But when I looked at my wrist, where he had grabbed me, there was no bruise, no mark. Just a patch of skin that was slightly translucent, like I was made of something less solid than the rest of the world. I haven't been back to that night shift since, but every time I look through a window, I wonder if I'm on the inside or the outside, and if I'm really still here at all. I don't expect you to believe me, but this happened to me last October on a stretch of dirt road that cuts through the Blackwood Pines near my grandfather's old cabin. It was just me, a sleeping bag, and a campfire that wouldn't quite catch in the damp air. The silence there isn't just quiet, it's heavy, like the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I'd gone out there specifically because I needed the isolation, thinking the distance from town would help me think, not realizing how small I actually was in that sea of trees. For the first 2 hours, everything was perfectly mundane. I was trying to get a photo of the moon through the canopy for a project I'm doing for work. The trees were tall, their branches interlocking so tightly that the sky looked like a fragmented puzzle. I set up my tripod near a fallen log, the kind that had been there for decades, rotting from the inside out. It felt odd that the wood was so soft, like spongy bread, but I dismissed it as the autumn moisture. I sat back on my camp stool, watching the embers of my fire pop and hiss, feeling a strange sense of peace. Then, I noticed the birds had stopped. Not gradually, but all at once. 1 minute they were chattering in the twilight, the next, absolute stillness. I assumed it was just the cold air, but the air didn't feel cold anymore. It felt warm, sticky, and thick against my skin. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just tired, and poured myself a cup of coffee to stay awake, even though I had no intention of sleeping. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound, but a smell. It wasn't the scent of pine or wood smoke. It was the smell of wet earth that had been turned over, like a fresh grave, mixed with the copper tang of old blood. It was so strong I had to cover my mouth with my sleeve. I looked around, convinced a deer or a small animal had died nearby, but the ground was pristine. Then, the fire started to die out on its own. The flames turned a sickly violet color for a moment before sputtering back to orange, but the heat vanished. I grabbed a branch to stoke the embers, and when I touched the wood, it felt warm, pulse-like, vibrating against my fingertips. I dropped it immediately, heart racing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that the adrenaline was making me imagine things. But then I heard a sound, distinct and rhythmic. A soft, wet slapping, like a bare foot stepping in mud, coming from the edge of the clearing, right behind where I'd set up my tripod. I spun around, but the woods were empty. I checked my watch, the time was wrong, the hands spinning slowly backward before settling on the current time. I stood up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely light a flashlight. The slapping sound started again, but this time it was closer, and it was accompanied by a low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I ran toward the truck, but it felt miles away. I stumbled back to the fire, trying to get it to flare up, but the wood wouldn't burn. That's when I saw it. Through the gap in the trees, standing directly in front of me but not quite there, was a figure. It looked like a man, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing clothes that were too big for him, soaked in the same dark sludge. But the worst part was the face. It was smooth, featureless skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be, yet I could feel its attention burning into me. It took a step forward, and the ground didn't crunch, it rippled like water. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly, as if the forest had just exhaled my voice. The figure reached out a long, pale hand, and the last thing I saw before I scrambled backward was a smile stretching across its face, formed by the skin pulling tight, creating a jagged, unnatural line. I drove home without stopping, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I washed my clothes, but the smell of wet earth and copper wouldn't leave. I went back to the cabin a week later to check my equipment, but the spot where the fire had been was just a patch of scorched earth, perfectly circular. I found my tripod, but the legs were bent at impossible angles, twisted as if by a giant's hand. I packed up and left, but I never went back to that road. The lingering detail that haunts me is my boots. They were dry when I left, but now, every morning, the soles are caked with fresh, dark mud, and the smell is always there, no matter how much I scrub them. I know I didn't step in a puddle, because the ground was frozen hard. I just don't know what stepped out with me. I've never told anyone this, not even to my sister, because the words just feel like they don't fit in the right way. It was 3 years ago, late in October, when I took my car out to the edge of the Blackwood region. I was driving to check on a cabin I'd bought on a whim, a place that looked perfect on the listings but felt completely wrong the moment I pulled off the gravel road. It was just past midnight, the kind of cold that seeps through the glass and settles in your bones, and the silence out there was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The cabin was a small, A-frame structure surrounded by dense pines that seemed to lean in too close. I drove up the driveway, the headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in faster than the weather forecast had promised. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something else, a faint metallic tang like old pennies left in the rain. I unpacked my bag, set up my camera on the tripod to capture the stars through the large window, and made coffee. The kettle whistled, a sharp, loud sound that seemed to echo too much in the small space. I remember walking out to the porch to get some fresh air, looking up at the sky, and noticing that the stars were all wrong. They were too bright, arranged in patterns that felt deliberate, like someone had turned the dial on the universe up a notch just to see what would happen. I blamed the fatigue, the altitude, or maybe just the way the light hit the trees. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire. The first sign that something was off was the sound of the floorboards. I heard a footstep in the hallway, right outside the living room where I was sitting. It was heavy, slow, like a bare foot dragging across the wood. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe a raccoon outside knocking something over. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and found nothing. Just the dark corridor and the closed bathroom door at the end. I went back to the fire, but the temperature in the room had dropped. I could see my breath now, even though I was wearing a sweater. Then, the camera I had set up to record the stars started recording audio, even though I had turned off the screen. I listened to the playback later, and for 30 seconds, there was a rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails on the outside of the window, moving from left to right. I told myself it was the wind, or the branches of the trees outside, but the sound was too close. It was right up against the glass. I spent the next hour trying to rationalize it. I told myself I was having a panic attack, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I tried to call my phone, but there was no signal. I went to the window, peering into the darkness, and saw a figure standing in the tree line. It was tall, wearing a long coat that seemed to ripple in a wind I couldn't feel. It didn't move. It just watched. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and decided to leave. I grabbed my keys and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. I pulled the handle, twisted the lock, kicked at the wood, but the door felt like it was made of stone. The scratching on the window started again, louder now, and the figure in the trees moved closer. I could see it now, its face a blur of features that didn't quite belong together, shifting and rearranging as I watched. The worst part was when the window gave way. Not because it broke, but because the glass simply dissolved into mist. The cold rushed in, but it wasn't air, it was a physical weight, pressing against my skin like water. The figure stepped inside, filling the space between me and the door. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, stolen by the sheer presence of it. It didn't attack me, it just stood there, close enough that I could see its eyes, two hollow pits that reflected nothing but my own terror. It reached out a hand, and the skin on my arm began to turn gray, the color draining away as if my blood was being replaced by ash. I couldn't move, couldn't run, just watched as the figure leaned in, its face inches from mine, and whispered a name I hadn't heard in years. I woke up the next morning on the side of the road, my car still running, the engine idling in the silence. The cabin was gone. There was nothing there but a pile of ash and charred timber, as if a fire had burned it down in the middle of the night. I never went back, and I don't know if it was ever real or just a nightmare brought on by the isolation. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I can still smell that metallic tang, and I can feel the cold creeping in from the passenger seat. The worst part is that my car has been in the shop for a week, and the mechanic says the engine is fine, but when I listen to the audio on my phone, there's a faint scratching sound coming from the dashboard, right where the engine block should be, moving in a rhythm that I know all too well. Thanks for listening tonight. If you're sitting here wondering if what just happened could really be true, you're not alone. I want to hear from you. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Drop your story in the comments below. Sometimes just reading them makes the silence feel a little less heavy. Next time, I've got 3 stories that are even harder to explain than this one. If you want to stay updated on the things I can't explain, hit that subscribe button. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.